Welcome back to another episode of First Light. Today we have a truly special guest join us, Reverend Erin Wathen. Erin is the pastor of Grace Emmanuel United Church of Christ in Louisville, Kentucky, an author and a powerful advocate for social justice and gender equality. Her books explore the intersection of faith and activism, helping modern families navigate these turbulent times while remaining rooted in their values. Erin, thank you for being here with us. Let's start by diving into your path to ministry and what drew you to this unique intersection of faith and justice. Erin, thank you for being here with us. Let's start by diving into your path to ministry and what drew you to this unique intersection of faith and justice.
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. And I think as many times as people have asked me about kind of my faith story, my call story in my life, I've probably told it that many different ways. Like, I don't think I've got a standard answer to this question. So it's a story that it was kind of a long and winding road, and it was also just kind of an all at once way of things coming together for me. When I got out of college, I really kind of had no idea what I was going to do with myself, and I got a job at a motel, and it was a lot of fun, but I knew that wasn't where I was going to be forever, and I was really interested at that time in nonprofit work. And I actually still have a lot of interest in the nonprofit world, and I work with a lot of partners here locally to kind of stay connected with that. It's such a strange thing to think about how different my life and path might have been if I'd been just a little bit younger and had the internet and social media at my disposal at that time in my life. Because, internet was around, but it wasn't pervasive. We didn't have these phones in our hands and just endless networks of people and resources available to us. So when I started thinking about nonprofit work, I didn't really know what that looked like or where to get a toe in, and now, of course, there's endless numbers of programs where you can get certifications and internships and get in these networks of nonprofit leaders. And yeah, that probably existed 25 years ago, but I had no idea where to begin, right? So somebody suggested I maybe check out with the seminary, see what kind of classes that they had. So I thought, okay, I can take a couple classes at the seminary and see where that leads. And, before I knew it, I was surrounded by all these people that were going into ministry, and I felt this kind of deep sense of connection with that community. And was also, meanwhile, I was still connected with the church that had always been a big part of my life. And I realized too that some of the other careers I had always had in the periphery of my mind, like I'd always wanted to be a writer. I'd thought about being a teacher. I enjoyed public speaking, thought about counseling and therapy, that sort of path. And I was just sitting in one of these classes one day and realized ministry is literally every one of those jobs and every one of those roles. And so there I was already in that classroom setting and on that path. And I was like, oh, well, maybe this is the way to do all of those things. And that's really exactly what it's been. I've served in different roles and different kind of different sizes of congregations and different communities. I've had a smallish church in Phoenix and then a much larger church in Kansas City. And then, now, of course, I'm at a kind of smaller church again here in Louisville. And in between all that, I've been a blogger and written several books. And then I also had a small break from congregational ministry for a few years where I worked with the disaster response ministry for my denomination. So, and in between all that somewhere, I did go back to school and I got a certification in nonprofit leadership. So primarily focused on communications and fundraising. So I really have gotten to explore all of those paths that I was thinking about at that younger time in my life. And then, at some point did come into the evolution of technology where I was able to be connected with wider groups of people doing all that different kind of work. So that's a little bit of how I got here. And what I've found in ministry across all these different settings is, coming in contact with a lot of people like you that may have had some church involvement in their past, in their background. And then, life happens. You start adulting. Many factors come into play as far as like where you live and what your day-to-day life looks like. And broadly, culturally speaking, that church has just sort of fallen out of relevance for a lot of folks. Just maybe doesn't fit into your life, or a lot of people have been burned by the church. That's like where maybe the church has been way too focused on some sense of like moral posturing, who's in, who's out, the gatekeeping that goes on. And I find that a lot of my focus has become changing that narrative, making church something that is accessible to people, that something that fits into your life, that's not about pressure or guilt or shame, but that gives people a meaningful community, which I don't know how you survive without that, but that is first and foremost a meaningful place of community with opportunities to serve and give back and help other people, and also find some sort of spiritual life that, you're supported by the community and you've got this safe place to ask questions and have doubt, but that can be unique to every person, so that you don't have to fit into a certain box of belief or a certain type of theology in order to find that. So that's really kind of how I got to the place I am, where I'm both pastoring a church and also writing and trying to kind of help articulate a language of faith for all kinds of people, whether or not they would call themselves religious or whether or not they have a church home.
There's so much to unpack. And
yeah, that was a really long answer, but take any part of that you want to talk more about.
Well, and there's a lot of it, but where I want to go back to actually is because for a lot of listeners, they won't know that you and I grew up in London, Kentucky. We grew up going to the same church, First Christian Church, there on Main Street in London. So I want to go back there just briefly and talk about growing up in Southeast Kentucky, growing up in London, Kentucky, growing up, in First Christian Church, and how that shaped you and kind of made you the person that, you are today, and in that ways, because obviously you and I share that journey.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that church was a huge part of my life. I mean, my mom sang in the choir and played the organ. Both of my parents served as deacons and elders at some point. I remember a lot of Sundays, if it was one of their turns to serve, after church, we didn't go straight home or straight to lunch. We would make the rounds and stop by the nursing home and take communion to the folks that couldn't come to church, and take the recorded tape from service and pick up their tape from last week so it could get re-recorded. Like that was just a big part of my life. And then, never missed a vacation Bible school when I got a little bit older, never missed a youth group mission trip or lock-in, sleepover, whatever was going on. I was always there, but still that never put anything in my mind about like gonna be a minister someday. But it still, gave me that sense of church being kind of the center of community life. And so that was very formative for me. But I would say, another thing that really was shaping me that I didn't even realize was how, at that time anyway, I'd say quite a lot has changed, but that being a Disciples of Christ church in that little pod of the world, they were really sort of this bright light of progressive religious thought and values in that time. And I didn't even know that was outside the norm for where we lived, right? It was just what I knew. But then when I got in kind of high school, maybe I started realizing that it was weird that we had women elders and women deacons, and that the women could lead prayer and the women could lead classes that had men in them, and the women could serve communion. Like I had no idea that there was any other way until, like I said, I was maybe 16 and I'd bring a friend to youth group and they'd be like, you have women serving communion? You have women? And I was like, what glacier did you all just hop off of that this is strange to you? But, the more I learned how unique that was for that region of the world, the more grateful I was that I had grown up thinking that was just the way things were. And so I never had any of the baggage to sift through about like, oh, women aren't supposed to be ministers. It was something that had been modeled for me in every part of life and leadership. And so, sorry. Somebody else can get that. But, I would say that was very formative for me to be like, I was raised by a group of people who see me as a whole person unto myself, who value what I think. I think I even had the opportunity to preach, like it was Youth Sunday of my senior year, and tradition always was that the seniors brought the message that day, and whatever that looked like, so I was one of a couple of seniors that year that gave the message, and I didn't think anything of it. Who knows what I talked about? I don't remember, but I do remember not thinking it was strange or scary to get up front and be in the pulpit, just because this was the church family. This is who had raised me. And, I'm sure I had plenty to say. Whether it was worth listening to or not is another question. But, I was very grateful to have been raised in a place that was so inclusive in that way. And, I think another thing unique to that church, and again, I don't know that this is still what it's like there, but we didn't grow up hearing a lot of sin and shame. That that tradition is not focused on atonement theology. So you're really learning more about the gospel of Jesus, about what it is to serve, to be a disciple in the world, to just stake your life in community and love your neighbor and know that your well-being is tied up in that of the people around you, not just your immediate family, but all of your neighbors. And I'm grateful for that too, because in my line of work, I come across a lot of people who have to unload a whole lot of spiritual trauma before they can begin to come into their own in a healthy and meaningful life of faith.
Yeah, I look back on my years growing up there as well, and I'm fond of all the memories that I had at that church and how lucky and grateful I am to have grown up in that church as well. And my dad being a deacon, going to the nursing home after church before going to brunch up at the Ramada Inn
Ramada.
there. I'll never forget those days. But, since you talked about it, I do want to ask you, as a woman in leadership within a church, what challenges have you faced or encountered, and what progress have you seen regarding the role of women in the ministry? And I know you have a diverse, being out in Arizona, Missouri, and now in Louisville, Kentucky, a lot of experience. So tell us a little bit about the role, any challenges that you may have faced.
Yeah, well, I've been really lucky because I've served churches solely in the Disciples of Christ and the United Church of Christ traditions. And those are both denominations that have been ordaining women since the 1800s. So I've never come across any roadblocks of like, you're not really supposed to be here. That's not to say that those churches across the country all have women in these primary leadership roles, because while we have, I would say, more than half of the women coming out of seminary right now more than half the people coming out of seminary right now in most mainline denominations are women, but that doesn't mean women are always called to the sole pastor, the lead pastor role, right? We're still very underrepresented, especially in larger churches. But I have still been lucky in the particular congregations that I served, where the people were very supportive and affirming of my leadership. I'd say I've come up with more weirdness from people in the wider communities. Like you go to the clergy gatherings and maybe you're the only woman there, and like the older guys assume you're somebody's wife or somebody's secretary. Get a lot of side eye when I park in the clergy parking spots at the hospital. Had a lot of people look at me like, you don't really, or I've, had to fight for my parking validation a couple of times and show a business card, or find myself on a website and be like, no, really, this. So I would say little things like that are really just more irritating than anything. But it does make me mindful of the fact that, like, the world has, the church particularly has not kept pace with progress in the world. And there are still so many churches where women are not empowered to lead or to speak. And there's this whole toxic culture of patriarchy surrounding that, where the church can get kind of entrenched and uphold these really rigid gender roles and expectations in ways that are not just not acceptable in other parts of society, they're illegal. Like, you couldn't go into a Fortune 500 company and say, okay, we're happy to hire women as assistants, even managers, but we're not gonna interview any women for the CFO or the CEO position because we don't believe that. Yeah, you can't do that in corporate America anymore, but it's absolutely acceptable in the church, right? And what really, really gets to me is I think there are a lot of people, women in particular, sitting in the congregation at these huge mega churches every Sunday who don't realize that, like, it isn't just that we happen to not have women preach. It's not allowed. It's part of the teaching, and that they just accept that. And these are professional women. These are educated women. They would not think that is okay in any other area of their life. But for the church, it's just come to be like, oh, that's just the way it is. And I've even had conversations with people before that I know them to be members of. Again, it's often a non-denominational mega church. They're the most innocuous about it, but they'll say, "Oh yeah, that's really cool that you're a pastor. I wish we had women preach in our church sometimes." And I'll be like, "Well, it's not allowed, right? Your church doesn't believe that's okay. And here's all these reasons." They'll tell you it's not okay, and they get real uncomfortable because they don't want to dig that deep. I guess they don't want to think that their church sees them as in some way not fit, but they also are happy to go sit there and enjoy the music every Sunday. And that it just really bugs me. I try to hold a space of non-judgment for folks like that. But again, in every major city in America, there are several, not one, but several churches like that with thousands and thousands of members. And I kind of go, the folks sitting in those churches they're business leaders in the community. They're teachers. They might be on city council. They might be in law enforcement. They're representing every kind of segment of society. And they go around believing that women only belong in certain places. And it's, there's a big disconnect there that is always going to be unsettling to me.
Well, you're a pastor of a congregation that honors, I believe, both, ancient Christian traditions as well as the modern expressions of worship.
Yes.
So how do you balance maintaining these early traditions with the embracing the new, particularly as the church evolves, in this kind of digital age that we live in now?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's constantly evolving. And what's interesting is I'd say most churches that are more progressive socially tend to be a little bit more traditional in worship style, believe it or not. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But, our church, as far as, style and the vibe, I guess, of worship, we do more of the traditional hymns and everything, but kind of, a blend of the kinds of music that we have in worship. But we're also, we're a small church. Like, if we had a full on praise band up front, it's going to be weird vibes. So, I think one of the primary starting points for me for worship is always keep it simple. Like the first churches in Acts, in the epistles and all those places in scripture where the early church is just forming, they're in small groups meeting in people's homes. So I really like for worship to be an experience that, yes, we might have 100 people here doing this together on a Sunday morning, but why do anything differently than we would do it if we were at one of our houses with just 10 of us? So I kind of start there. And I think worship it's an active community. It's not just the person up front. And sidebar, that's another thing that gets me about the people that'll really dig in about, well, women shouldn't preach, women shouldn't lead. I'm like, community or worship is about all of us. It's about what all of us bring. And if you really are fixated on what boxes the pastor has to check, then you're putting way too much on the role of the pastor. You're elevating them to a point that is really kind of unhealthy and takes away from the communal nature of the act of worship. And so with that said, I think it's, you've got the parts of corporate worship that are about the voice of community, right? You've got singing, you've got prayers that are spoken together, parts of liturgy that are call and response. And it's about telling the story of our faith, whether that's the pastor saying, here's what the scripture says, and here's how we're living this today, or whether that is, different people taking turns, sharing their own faith stories. I like to think we have a little bit of both of those things. And then, the tradition we were raised in, the disciples of Christ, is very focused on communion. The act of communion is at the center of the worship experience. And we practice an open table, which is reflective of our whole approach to faith, what we believe about the Christian community being open to everyone, that Jesus came for everyone, and that we don't come and receive these elements because we are perfect. We come because we know we're not perfect, and we're on this journey together with all these other imperfect people. And when we come to the table, we remember these stories of who we are and where we came from and the Christ that we are striving to be like. And so to me, that's all worship needs to be. And if there's much more going on than that, you've kind of jumped the shark a little bit. It can become more of a production, more of a performance. And I think the larger a church gets, the more danger you fall into of it becoming a performance. And I'm not saying worship can't be authentic or meaningful in a larger group. I just think the larger your group, the more you've got to be intentional about kind of keeping it real and approachable, right? But yeah, for me, it's all about kind of keeping it communal and keeping it relevant to where we are today too. And you mentioned technology, like our church does stream worship, and they had to deal with COVID before I got here, right? So I can't take any credit for this, but for a small church, they shifted remarkably well over to, okay, we got to get something that's online for all this time we can't be here in person. And so, after COVID, when it was back in person, it was like, okay, not only are we going to keep this online option, we're going to upgrade our technology to make it a better quality kind of experience for people at home, because we realized it's not just about, this one kind of extraordinary period in our history where people couldn't get together. There are always people that are unable, whether physically or for some other reason, to come to church. And I also realized more and more, I've always served churches in larger metro areas. But if you live in London, Kentucky, where we're from, or any other number of smaller and rural communities around the country, there is not a church anywhere near you that feels safe if you are gay or trans or gender nonconforming. There's not a church anywhere near you that feels safe if you feel strongly that women need to be in leadership. There may not be a church anywhere near you that fits your needs if you care deeply about social justice and racial equality, and so all of a sudden I'm going, our church people are not just people here in the Louisville area. They're people, all across the country that are looking for a community, a place of meaningful connection with other believers that may not have a community like that in their own physical proximity, but they can log on here on Sunday mornings and feel like they're a part of this body of worship And I'm just always trying to find more ways to connect with those folks and that they feel like they are adding their presence to the gathering, whether that's like, I might ask a question to the congregation in the course of a sermon, because I'm pretty conversational in my teaching style, and I might say, hey, if you're at home, drop in the comments and tell us, something. Or like in the greeting, I'll say, hey, maybe drop us a picture of where you are this morning, what worship looks like from your place. And, I think that's very much an ongoing conversation among faith leaders right now, is how do we maintain those connections in this increasingly remote world we're living in, and it's just endless possibilities of the people we can be connecting with on Sunday morning. But at the same time, you've also got to still create that urgency among your local folks to show up when you can, because there is something about being together that is what keeps the church thriving. And so it's all about finding that balance.
Yeah. One thing I want to talk about is the Power of Five. It's something I talk about a lot on this podcast, and something that kind of has changed my life. And those are your mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and financial well-being. And when I went through that Power of Five exercise, though I grew up in church, and though I've attended church on and off over the years, I graded myself low spiritually. And so this past year, I've really worked on that spiritual connection. And what I realized was that until I was truly ready for that connection, until I'd made up my mind that that's what was important to me, it was tough. It was easy to go to church and say, well, I don't connect with the pastor, or the band plays, a certain way, or I don't like the songs they picked. And there's always excuses for that, until I was ready myself to be connected. Now, it's not so much the pastor or the music or the band or how I was greeted at the front door or any of that kind of things. It's about my relationship with God. So I want you to talk about, for those who are maybe working on themselves, how important that spiritual component is, whether it's, church, or whether it's God, or some other type of faith. Um, it truly is something that impacts me in a big day. Now I start my days with prayer. I start my days with Bible reading, and the impact it's had on my life is just amazing. So, can you talk a little bit about those people out there that may be struggling in this modern age, in this modern world, of being disconnected from the church, or not feeling that connection to the church?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's different for everybody, and there's so many reasons. Like I said, I encounter a lot of people that have experienced some sort of what I would call religious trauma. A church that has really hit it hard on the shame and you're inherently sinful and all this, that message, that really runs deep and does harm to particularly children. I think in a way we don't realize really sticks with folks and can impact their mental health their whole life long. So I think that's one driver of people who have just decided that, like, okay, for my own well-being, church is not for me. And I fully respect that and understand it. Again, especially if you're a person who's maybe LGBTQ and has heard your whole life that you are broken and you're a sinner and you're going to hell and all the, like, I get not wanting to be a part of church. I get not trusting that there's a place for you there. That there, there's also these kind of broader cultural factors. I think we're just so saturated with input, with constant noise, with the 24-hour news cycle, with the phone in our hand that we can pick up at any point and feel like we're getting our needs met, which we aren't, by the way. But, we have all these other things that demand our time and our attention, not to mention our money. Then you come to church and they're asking you for money too. And it's like, it feels like just one more thing that there's not enough time for. And in particular, during COVID, I think even a lot of folks that were connected with the church and did have it as a big part of their life kind of fell out. And it's so easy to just get out of the habit of going, and it's so hard to get back into it, right? So with that confluence of factors, on top of the fact that we are such a secular society right now, it is really, really hard to get yourself into any sort of spiritual rhythm, any sort of discipline that helps feed that part of yourself that you may not even know is missing. But I think discipline is the primary word there. And it's just like, all these other things you're talking about, taking care of your physical health, finding a time to work out. You just got to start somewhere, right? It's just a matter of starting somewhere and knowing that your first effort is not going to be perfect, and knowing that you might have to try several different things, maybe countless different things, until you find the thing that works for you, the thing that you can work into your life. But the most important thing to remember is that, again, it's going to be different for everybody. And so a different thing's going to work for everybody. But no matter who you are, you have a need, whether you know it or not. You have a deep need for meaningful community, and you also have a need for an inner spiritual life. Because at the end of the day, your community is going to let you down at some point. Your best friends will let you down. Your family will let you down. And I'm not saying that to be morose. It's just a fact of human life, and the more you have cultivated your own spiritual strength and inner fortitude, the more you'll be able to weather those times and then repair those relationships. For some people, you start with the community of belonging. You start with finding a church where you feel at home. And sidebar here, you were talking about having finally kind of got back into that rhythm. I know we live in such a consumer-based culture too, that I think a lot of people go about church shopping as if you are literally shopping, like for a product. And you go in and you're like, all those things you mentioned, well, I don't like the songs they sang today, or I don't really like that pastor or that message today, or the building's too big, or the building's too small, or they had the AC up too high today. It's any number of things, knowing you're not going to find like the perfect thing, but finding a community of people that align with your values, what you believe is important, and where you feel like you are welcome and can be yourself. I think that is of utmost importance. And then finding those personal, on your own time kinds of things, whether it's a long walk in the woods in the morning, or some quiet time of meditation or journaling before you go to bed at night, or taking a break in the middle of the day to read scripture. All that's important too. Whichever one you find first, but ideally your community of faith also equips you with those spiritual practices to build into your own life on your own time. So it's not just something you're doing on your own. It's something you're doing as a part of your life in the community of faith, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you struck on another chord there that I want to ask you about is, obviously you lead a church, you're married, you've got kids, you find time to counsel, you find time to write books, you do a blog, you do so much. So how do you manage to keep it all in check and remain so strong in your faith and balance all the pulls of your time?
Yeah, well, first let me just be transparent in saying I don't always do it perfectly, but it's an ongoing balancing act that is in itself, I think, a spiritual discipline. And it changes, right? With seasons of life, what that means is different. Like when I had younger kids, oh my God, just the demand of parenting younger kids is completely consuming. But also at that part of my life, I had, my husband was a stay-home dad for a few years when the kids were young. So that really helped, just knowing that I didn't have to be at every school drop off and pick up and packing lunches, and that constant was not there for me. Well, now, kids are older. My husband and I both work, but we've also got 2 teenagers at home, and dear Lord, that's his whole other thing, right? So the balancing act changes. But, I was actually talking to a class of seminary students last night about this very thing about our ethical codes of conduct and our boundaries. And somebody asked us that same thing, like, how do you keep it all in balance? And how do you take time to care for yourself? And one thing I told them was, the older I get, the more I don't have a choice, because my body lets me know when it's too much. My body lets me know, like I get sick, or I go to the doctor and they say my blood pressure's off the charts. And if I don't change something, I'm going on meds, or, my neck will go out. Like, this started years ago. If I'm too stressed and I do too much, or I sleep on it weird, or I sneeze wrong, it doesn't matter. But I get this pinched nerve thing and I literally cannot move. And so it's like, one way or another, I take care of myself, or it's a bad deal if I don't. So I really find time for movement every day, even if it's just a walk. I try to work out 3 or 4 days a week, but life happens. So I find time for at least a walk, even if I can't do anything else. I try to not have more than 2 evenings a week that I have something at night. So that's one liability of church life. In any size congregation, the times of day that people are available to do things and to meet tends to be evening. But if you're not careful, you can have something every night on top of your kids' activities and all that. So I try to limit my evenings. I take my day off every week. If something comes up and I can't, I try to take a different day, or at least an extra window of time somewhere that I'm not doing anything. Yeah, I try to eat well. It's an art, not a science, but I try to limit how much junk goes into my body. And I think that makes better things come out of my life and how I spend my time. So just a little combo of that. Again, however imperfectly I do it, those are a few of the practices that I keep. And one thing I realized when I was a young parent, and I've told this to lots of other people over the years, particularly in ministry, but I think it applies to other parts of life. It's like, you have this guilt when you're at work and you're not home with your kids, but you also have this guilt when you're with your kids and you feel like you should be working, and that is so toxic. Like, where do we get that? No matter what I'm doing, it's bad because I should be doing something else, So I tried to deprogram that loop in my head. And I said, you know what? When I'm at work, when I'm doing the work of the church, when I'm being a minister, I am building the community of faith that I want my kids to be part of. I am strengthening this village that is a big part of who's bringing up my kids and teaching them how to be followers of Jesus, And so when I'm at church, it's not like I'm not doing anything for my kids. And when I'm with my kids, when I'm parenting, I am raising the people that are going to be future church leaders. I am building them up to be compassionate humans. I am teaching them to prioritize serving and sharing and all those things that I preached on Sunday morning. So I kind of gave myself some grace and said, these are not your life is not compartmentalized. You're not letting one of these things go while you're focused on the other one. They feed each other.
Your most recent book, I know you've authored several books now, but you had a new one that just come out. So talk to us a little bit about your role as an author and writing books, and how you really see that as an extension of being a pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. I see writing as an extension of the pulpit, and for years I was a blogger, had a pretty big platform on Patheos. And during COVID, I let that go for like many reasons, like had kind of a parting of ways with that platform and how they were managing their business. But also just, I think like a lot of people during that time, I just lost all my creative energy, was focused on just trying to figure out life. And excuse me. So I hadn't written much in a while, and I knew I still had, the writing was still a big part of me. I didn't want to get back into the blogging I was doing, which was very much what I'd call in the zeitgeist, right? I was always trying to tap into what is trending, what's the big story everybody's talking about today, and have something to say about it. and felt like people were waiting to see what I was going to have to say about it, which some people were. And in this way, I was kind of like helping articulate that intersection of life and faith for people in ways that, like, I'm not saying anything profound that nobody else has ever thought about, but I was helping put the language of faith around it for people to help them process and to help them live in their own contexts. But I wanted my writing, when I started again, to not be as reactive, to not be as plugged into the news feed and the day-to-day things, but something a little bit more lasting. And I was talking to my editor, Jessica, who's wonderful, and we actually both live here in Louisville, which when we did our first couple of books together, I was in Kansas City and she was in Nashville, and we've both ended up in Louisville. So it's great. But I was talking to her and, talking about how I needed to write something. And she said, well, we need somebody. I'm sorry, this turned into a really long story, but she said, we need somebody, we need somebody to do our Advent resource this year, because the publisher, they put out an Advent Christmas book every year. She said, that might give you a toe back in the water and just get you writing again. I said, that sounds great. So that's kind of where that started. And she told me to come up with a couple of different theme options that she could pitch to her team. And I came up with several, and we picked the two that we liked best. And actually the first one, the one I ended up writing was not the first choice originally, but as I started kind of making some notes and outlines for both of them, I was like, no, this other one's it. This is where my heart's at right now. And so we went with the theme of Calling All Angels, which, by the way, that's not a reference to the Train song. It's Waylon Jennings. Go look it up. It's an amazing piece. But it's about the angels that appear to people leading up to the birth of Jesus. And every single one of them says, do not be afraid. Do not fear. And so the book, it's an Advent devotional and study guide meant to be used, as an individual or in a small group, in a church setting or at home. But the whole focus of it is on that message of don't be afraid. And my editor thought that, no matter what happens in November, that's going to be a timely message in December. Because everybody is terrified right now. No matter who you're going to vote for, you're terrified of what's going to happen if the other side and that's part of the machine, right? The media machine. It makes us afraid, because the more afraid we are, the more we want to be plugged in every second to see what's the next calamity, what's the next big thing that's coming, and having that sense of just constant angst about what's going on in the world right now. So what we're talking about is that do not be afraid is the most repeated sentiment in Scripture. Do not fear, do not be afraid. It starts with God visiting Abraham in Genesis, and it goes on from there. So this is the story of 4 angel visits leading up to the birth of Jesus. One is to Zechariah, who is the father of John the Baptist. One is to Mary, one is to Joseph, and then, of course, the shepherds out in the field that get kind of the fright of their life, and they're told to go down and see this baby that's been born in the manger. Every one of those starts with hey, don't be afraid, like about to tell you something really crazy, but don't be afraid, because ultimately every one of those people / groups of people had an opportunity to step into this incredible story and play a major role in it. And a lot of times in our lives, when something feels scary to us, it's actually an opportunity. It's an invitation to be a part of something, to have a faithful response to what is happening and to what God might be doing in the world that is new and amazing even today. And when you get right down to it, most of the ills of society, and not in a new way, but just of all time, most of the things that are broken in the world are because of how people have reacted out of fear. how we build systems that are meant to control and manipulate and keep people out. We have this fear of scarcity that causes us to hoard resources rather than share them. Like, you name any social problem we have right now, it's because people have responded out of fear. And so that's kind of another major message of the book, is that, it's normal to be afraid. That's a very human thing. And there's a lot of things in the world happening right now that are scary, and you cannot deny that. And we're not sticking our heads in the sand. But just because there are many things to fear doesn't mean we have to be fearful people. Just because we feel afraid sometimes doesn't mean we have to respond out of fear. So what is the faithful response to fear? And that's kind of the heart of the book there. And we are waiting. It's an Advent. We're waiting for the birth of the Prince of Peace. The response to fear should not be violence, right? The response should not be more guns. It's lay down your weapons. We are waiting for the Jesus to be born, who would go on to feed everyone, right? What's the response when we fear scarcity, when we fear price gouging and inflation, all that? The response is not, let's take away all the food stamps and free lunches. The response is feed everyone, because there's enough. And that's kind of the counterpoint throughout the book, is what's the faithful response to the very real human fear that is kind of all around us right now.
I do want to ask you, I guess, one final thought is, what role does the church and faith play in that today, in today's times?
Well, it's kind of multifold, but one of the primary responsibilities of the church right now, I think, is to tell the story, to keep telling these stories of our faith and bringing them into the moment, reminding people that, as we say in the United Church of Christ, God is still speaking. These stories, it's not something that happened once a long time ago. These are stories that show us how God moves and is present in the world, and that we believe God's still moving and present in the world in those same ways. And so the more we tell the stories, the more we help people cultivate that kind of vision to see where these things are still happening, and how we step in and live as people of faith. I think another role of the church is kind of, calling up people's generosity, reminding people that none of us has anything that we have just all on our own, right? Everything that we have is a gift from God, and most everything that we have is, in part because of a lot of good luck and crazy privilege, right? And if what we have came to us by means of privilege, then it is our responsibility to share. And so I think the church is really, really needs to be focused on kind of calling up people's generosity. And that's not just about wealth. That's about how we share time, talent, and treasure, right? Not just living unto ourselves in these little enclaves, because honestly, the more we have, the more we can kind of sequester ourselves off and feel like we don't need people. We don't need a community. We don't need to just spend time with our neighbors, and, just keep continually calling people out of themselves and into the life of community. I think that's a big part of where we're at right now, especially as we continue to, the church in general, fighting for its relevance. Like I said, in this increasingly cultural age, and when church has got such a bad rap for being hateful and hypocritical and only caring about money, or only caring about, who belongs and who doesn't. Like, I think it's more important now than ever for us to be focused on building compassionate communities that are diverse and inclusive, and kind of break down a lot of the walls that the rest of the world tells us that we need more of.
I know there's some valuable insights in there, and I won't forget the don't be afraid.
Yeah.
And so thank you so very much for your time. I appreciate you joining us on First Light and sharing your journey and sharing your inspiration.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Chris. It's so good to see you.
You too. Thank you. Erin, thank you so much for joining us on First Light today. Your insights into faith, social justice, and leadership are truly inspiring. As always, First Light listeners, keep shining your light, and we'll see you next time.